It's the spookiest time of the year, and Halloween has become a distinctly American holiday. But it wasn't always like this. So, in this episode, I sit down for a terrifyingly unscripted chat with Tom Smith to understand where Halloween came from, why it's associated with fear, and why it's so American. Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. From the faculty this week, returning is Tom Smith, Professor of American Literature and Culture and Deputy Director of Area Studies at the University of East Anglia. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi Liam, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's always great to chat, and I guess kind of in keeping with the fact that Halloween itself is a little bit unconventional, we're going a bit off piste with this episode because we're less planned than we normally are. So to start off, Tom, do you like Halloween?
Well, I do like Halloween, and I think one of the things that's interesting about Halloween is that when I was a kid, so stretching back a bit, Halloween really was not much of a thing in the UK. And so Halloween was one of those signifiers of Americanness that I thought was, particularly interesting. I think it was one of those things that caught your attention as being something that was culturally different. Just endless sitcom specials, Halloween special editions, all those things that made their way across the Atlantic, which seemed very kind of exciting and unusual and unpredictable and fun. And we really did not. We might have got toffee apple from the supermarket. That was that was the extent of it, really. So yeah, so I do like Halloween, and I definitely think it's one of those things that stoked my interest in Americanness. But now, of course, my kids growing up have a completely different understanding of it. You know, they dress up every year, they go trick or treating. We've kind of completely imported that what would have been seen as a very American celebration when I was younger, anyway.
Yeah, I'm with you. When I was growing up, trick or treating was still a thing. It wasn't something that everyone did. You kind of got maybe half a dozen knocks at the door through an evening. But yeah, I still remember Halloween being seen as this very American thing. And it's only, I guess, really in the last sort of 20 years that it's taken off on this side of the pond as well.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting how we've just kind of absorbed that and just almost like no questions asked, just taking it on board.
Well, it always looked fun, didn't it?
Yeah, that's the
But
thing.
I mean,
it is a fun holiday.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting irony is there, which we'll probably explore as we go along. That in a way we've kind of re-imported it because it's one of those classic folk holidays which made its way across the Atlantic, bubbled away for a bit, exploded, and then has come back over this side of the Atlantic with a new American sheen to it. So it's a really nice transatlantic case study as well, probably.
Yeah, and I think we all just think of Halloween as being about, the dressing up, the trick or treating, the parties, and all the stuff that kind of comes with in this sort of post commercialized Halloween.
Yeah.
But tell us, Tom, what is the history of Halloween and where did it come from?
Well, in American terms, especially in kind of the early colonial period, there really isn't a Halloween that you can speak of. Unsurprisingly, the Puritans around the Northeast are, for various theological and cultural reasons, not that into a holiday which seems to celebrate the more spooky aspects of life. So, any suggestion of consorting with evil spirits for a fun holiday that's also faintly Catholic in its associations, that was definitely a non-starter in much of colonial America. So there isn't really much of a prehistory of Halloween in America. If we're looking for the roots of what becomes an American Halloween, then we're looking to Scotland and Ireland primarily, because it seems clear. I mean, people often want to reach back and find a really deep pagan root to Halloween, which I think is always a bit tenuous. But we can definitely settle around the fact that there are clearly folk traditions that surround Halloween as a moment in the calendar in Ireland and Scotland. So very famously, for example, Robert Burns writes a poem in the late 18th century about Halloween, which details lots of the superstitions and folk traditions that take place on Halloween in Scotland in the late 18th century. Now, I think one of the things that's really interesting about Halloween is that it really doesn't look much like anything that we're used to when we think of what does Halloween mean. It's a time of community celebration, often domestically speaking. You're not kind of out on the streets trick or treating. You're in your home. But what it really surrounds is a number of folk traditions and superstitions about trying to predict who, as a young unmarried person, you're going to marry. That really is at the heart of what Halloween as a folk celebration was in that time period. And there are lots of different aspects to that. So some of them would involve kind of looking in mirrors and saying incantations, and your bride or husband to be might appear behind you. Lots of things revolving around apples and apple peels. So you peel an apple in one strip right over your shoulder, and it will fall on the floor in the initial of the person you're going to marry. Lots of traditions involving nuts. So you put some nuts on the hearth of a burning fire, and you watch what they do, and if they explode, or if they start burning, or if they smoulder. These all have different meanings for your future health, wealth, and happiness, and particularly for your love life. And that is remarkably consistent. And so what we can see in America is that, from the late 18th, early 19th century onwards, you start to get a sense that immigrants from Scotland and Ireland have definitely taken those traditions to the New World with them, right? So that there is still a continuation of those folk customs taking place across the Atlantic in America. But again, very much framed around these kind of divination, light spell casting, love traditions. So that carries across throughout the late 18th and early 19th century. And you can see that bubbling away in America, but it's not a big deal. And it's definitely lots of regional variation that takes place. And interestingly, if we think about the spookiness of Halloween, right, the idea that we have of it, that it's completely melded to a kind of folk, to a horror tradition, to horror films, to ghost stories, to various types of monsters, that association is quite thin as well. Because at that period, Christmas was really the time period when you would tell ghost stories, right? There was a much more vigorous tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas time across the whole winter festivity period into the new year. So ghost stories on Christmas Eve, yes. Ghost stories on Halloween, not really. Maybe a sense of a kind of thinning of the veil between the living and the dead because of its association with All Hallows, but really not a very wedded tradition of telling ghost stories around that time period, at least at that period.
I wonder though if because as you say it was brought over by Europeans. If there's not so much an element of in the early days of commercialization of Halloween, but there had to be this almost Christianization of Halloween in America, where Halloween was then kind of used to sort of look at these kind of the dirty pagan rituals and like the stuff that was unpure and scary, and actually it was a way of kind of boxing that in
Right.
and
Yeah.
addressing it without kind of feeling like you're doing anything wrong.
Yes. Yeah. There could be something in that. I think. And I think it's a continuation of community identity as well, probably amongst migrant communities. I think that's probably a large part of it,
Mm.
because everyone seems to agree that it's really around the time of the Irish famine where you get much larger immigration from Ireland into America, that Halloween starts to have much more of a kind of cultural embeddedness in American life. You can see increasing references to it in the newspapers, in magazines, in stories, people playing with those kind of traditions. Probably some suspicion around it, though. Still, I think you're right in terms of its religious identity and its religious meaning, and therefore kind of some suspicions around it, especially as there is that kind of element of light witchery going on. But I think one thing that's also clear is that it's in that immediate post-Civil War period that we can see things coalescing, because Civil War, unsurprisingly, is a massive turning point in American life, both politically, in terms of the changes it brings, and socially, but also culturally. And there is definitely a sense after the Civil War of America looking for communal traditions that bring people together, that in some sense kind of bring the nation together, that are imbued with a sense of nostalgia for what seems to some to be a kind of simpler time before the war in the early 19th century, a connection to folk traditions from the old world, and also just a sense of fascination, an ongoing sense of fascination with the past, right? A developing sense of fascination with the past in American life. And so all these things kind of coalesce together to really amplify what have up until this point been quite regionally variant and sporadic celebrations. So we can lump Halloween in a sense with Thanksgiving and Christmas, which I know we'll talk about on other occasions. But you can see that all of those kind of civic expressions of identity really start to cohere and develop after the Civil War. And I think there's a great example in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, so a Brooklyn newspaper, in 1865. So just after the end of the Civil War, the first Halloween after the end of the Civil War, and they actually devote a column to thinking about Halloween as a celebration, and in a sense, not necessarily introducing its readers to this moment in the calendar, but definitely talking about it with a sense that this is something that is interesting. So they say that there is perhaps no night in the year which the popular imagination has stamped with a more peculiar character than this anniversary. And it talks about the idea that it's the night set apart for the universal walking abroad of spirits, both of the visible and of the invisible world. It talks about England and Ireland and its fireside customs. So it talks about the nuts and apples are everywhere, in requisition and consumed in immense numbers. So it's kind of painting a picture for its readers of what this moment might mean. It's attempting to foment a sense of this being a moment which has a history, which has an interesting folk continuation. And I think probably, again, the mass media helps with that, right? In that same moment where there is a growing interest in these kind of customs and traditions and how they might bring a sense of unifyingness to American life. This is also the time when newspapers and magazines are becoming even more influential in American culture. So, that helps really to spread a national sense of this moment. And what I think is particularly delightful is that, as well as giving this history lesson about Halloween and trying to remind its readers about what it is, they also give you a Halloween parody of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So it's "'Twas the night of All Hallows, when goblin and sprite were to roam, it is said, on that terrible night." So there we go, and then on it goes into an evocative portrait of Halloween. So I think that's a really good example of the way that in this immediate post-Civil War moment, things are coalescing, and Halloween is definitely becoming something that people are paying more interest and attention to.
When then do you think that it became what it is today? Because it feels like, from what you're saying, that Halloween, there was a nostalgia to it. There was a sort of a reminiscing, a looking back to days before the Civil War. And that's, I guess, the root of a lot of things that we celebrate even today. There's a nostalgia to them. But Halloween has become so much more than that now. It's about, it's about the materialistic things, the
Yeah,
sweets, the dressing up, the parties,
yeah.
When did that happen?
You can see that late 19th through the late 19th century, the consumption around all of these holidays becomes more of a theme. You get increasing industrialization, urbanization, and commercialization goes along with that. Late 19th century, I think you get a sense that Halloween becomes quite a riotous public affair. You get far more accounts of groups of young people playing pranks, creating chaos of one form or another in local environments, and taking it to the streets in that sense, which is not unlike what happens with Christmas, because Christmas starts off in the beginning of the 19th century as very much a kind of public street party. Yeah, I mean, that's true on both sides of the Atlantic. That Christmas is about being in the streets, drunken revelry in the streets, going from house to house, demanding drink or money or food or all three potentially. But
Sounds
that
great.
gets there we go. You can bring it back. Yeah, that gets domesticated and contained. And you can see the same thing happen to Halloween, really. The late 19th century, it develops its reputation as being a moment of chaos. And I think that still continues in parts of America. You have Devil Night, Mischief Night in different parts of the States where, not even necessarily on Halloween, but around that day, October 30th, in some places, where, there is still kind of that kind of anarchy and chaos that takes place. But you get the sense that very late 19th century, turn of the century, and into the early 20th century, Halloween starts becoming a holiday primarily directed at children, and I think that sense of consumption and consumerism goes along with that. So, for example, in 1895, Kindergarten magazine, which seems like an interesting guide to the changing status of the holiday, suggests that this is a time where a few days should be given to the spirit of Halloween. Then, if at any time, may fun and frolic reign. So that's from 1905. So you can see that children are being pushed forward as the focus of Halloween. So the dressing up, the trick or treating, the school parties, which develop into community parties. I think as a way to kind of push back against probably that more anarchic sense of the evening that develops elsewhere. And I think that the consumption goes hand in hand with that. But again, I think the 1950s seem to be a really important pivot point as well. Post World War II, you've got an American culture with a burgeoning youth population, and also a burgeoning consumer culture that go hand in hand together. And that really seems to be the time where what we might think of as a really recognisably modern Halloween takes shape. That's the point at which there's a critical mass of young Americans who are deeply engaged in a consumer culture that is wrapped up around the holiday. So I think that seems to be a moment that really pushes things forward again in what we understand as being Halloween.
Yeah. And do you, without wanting to sound too much like a prude with this question, is Halloween a responsible holiday? Because it still feels even today like it promotes these sort of slightly anarchic values
Yeah,
and just wrapped in a bit more tradition and sort of formality.
yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think probably that speaks to the fact that Halloween, arguably, is one of the more multifaceted of these kind of public moments, because Halloween really does mean a lot of different things to different people. So it can be kind of anarchic public drunkenness and bad behavior. It can be grotesque horror, but it can also be very light. It can also be very child focused still. So I think it does have a lot of different places in American culture, really, that have all been transported in probably quite an interesting translation around the world. So I think probably Americans often think that we don't really get Halloween still as much as we have imported it, wholesale. So I think that that's part perhaps of the problem. Maybe we probably don't understand Halloween still in the same way that Americans would. And of course, it's still very controversial in some senses. There's plenty of religious groups who don't like Halloween, who do think of it as being tinged with dark forces in a number of ways. But ultimately, I think probably one of the reasons that it abides is because it does still provide a sense of community that I think you don't necessarily get much in modern life anymore. Most major celebrations have become very domestically focused, turned inwards on the family. So we don't really have massive public Christmas celebrations anymore in the way that people would have done throughout the 19th century. We don't really have those moments of community cohesion shaped around these holidays. But with Halloween, you do. Even I think that's one of the interesting things about its importation to this culture. Halloween is one of the few times when I'm taking my kids around to our neighbours' houses that you actually get to see some of your neighbours. So I think there is that sense of it as being a communal moment potentially, where people give things out to their neighbours willingly, or maybe unwillingly sometimes, but nonetheless, if you want to engage with it, you can engage with it, and you are giving things to your neighbours in a way that we don't often do anymore, that would perhaps make us quite uncomfortable without that mechanism to do it. So I think it does have an interesting kind of civic community role to play, as much as it can also be a problematic festival probably.
Yeah, I was going to ask really, what is it about Halloween and what is it about being scared that we seem to enjoy so much? But I guess it's not really about that. It's Halloween's, as you say, it's come from. It's really a children's holiday.
Mm.
It feels like this idea of fear and the horror movies and the sort of the grotesque aspect of Halloween has been more of a kind of consequence of the holiday rather than the sort of roots of it.
Yeah. I think they're definitely pushing on an element that's perhaps always been there, but have definitely turned up the volume on that. I mean, perhaps there's something about making the strange and the grotesque and unfamiliar somehow approachable and
Mm.
even cute. I guess it disarms potentially
Yeah.
some of those more some of the darker elements of it.
I guess it's in the same way that you would go and see a horror film, and it's almost a safe space to feel those things and
Mm.
to challenge yourself and to experience fear, because at the end of that film you leave the theater and that's it. There's no danger. Halloween almost does the same thing on a maybe slightly more immersive scale.
Yes, slightly more glittery scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if you think that there will ever be a kind of a fizzling out of Halloween, because as you mentioned earlier, it was kind of, there was certain external triggers like the end of the Civil War, very much the moment that America was in as a nation that helped to sort of force this growth spurt in the celebration of Halloween. Do you think there will ever be a pivot where that will fade out?
Well, it doesn't seem particularly likely. I think one thing you can say is that I think there have been peaks and troughs in relation to how much America engages with it, even in recent times. I mean, there have famously been, a whole host of conspiracy theories about people tampering with food that they're giving out on trick or treating, the kind of iconic razor blades in apples and chemically laced candy treats, which I think still pop up from time to time, as I think have predominantly been urban myths, but had a kind of sticking power in some sense, which interestingly kind of pushes against that idea of, or is an attempt to push against that, the kind of communality, I guess, of Halloween. That it's attempted to inculcate suspicion in your neighbours again, and I think again the pandemic, I think probably put a dent in it to a certain degree. I think that seems to have limited trick or treat in that sense of our neighbours being contaminating in some sense, so best to avoid them. But I think by all reports, the last couple of years have seen things kind of bounce back. I think spending levels in America are over $10 billion a year at this point, which seems pretty robust for an industry. And I think there continues to be innovation in that kind of sphere of immersive Halloween experience. And there is something about the seasonality of it, because it seems so tied in now to what I think has come to be a kind of festive quarter of the year, in a sense that Halloween is not just a moment in and of itself, but Halloween is the moment at which the kind of autumn winter non-stop celebration extravaganza begins. We move from spooky season right into Christmas music, really. And Americans obviously have a stopping off point at Thanksgiving as well. So it does seem to be so firmly integrated into what has become a kind of 3-month consumer period that starts with Halloween on October 1st, really, and often I think people creep the decorations in before that, and end sometime around the New Year 12th night, really. So I think in the way that we've embedded these celebrations in our life in the 21st century, really, it seems unlikely that's going to be unpicked anytime soon.
This episode of America, a History podcast, was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to my guest this week, Professor Tom Smith. And if you enjoyed what you heard, do check out some of the extra resources that we've popped in the show notes. Additionally, a lot of work goes into the making of this podcast, so if you could leave a review or a rating wherever you're listening, that would be amazing. Next time, we look at a classic novel to understand the real reality of slavery, as we ask, what does Kindred tell us about plantation life?